following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners around the world on radio streaming and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Liana and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for navigating the madness of mental health using my top 10 sayings for checking in with your best self. This episode, we're talking about why smart people do dumb things. We all know someone who is a genius at a given subject, but makes absolutely terrible decisions in their personal lives. Or you might know someone who's very smart in one area, but makes zero sense in another. Say, a billionaire who's good at marketing electric cars, but then he decides to buy a social media site and couldn't admit he had no idea what he was doing. Smart people doing dumb things often comes down to poor assumptions, hubris, or both. Being smart is about knowing a lot of things. Being wise is about knowing what you don't know. But how do you know what you don't know? Well, that takes a lifetime to master, if you're lucky. Ethics, philosophy, and formal logic are not easy things to get your head around. And so many people think complex problems have simple solutions. Hopefully this show will help you embrace complexity. Tonight's guest is Dr. Jeff Nevid, author of the Minute Therapist blog on Psychology Today. Jeff will be here to talk to us about how smart people, how successful people go wrong in their self-talk. And I'm having Jeff on to help us not talk ourselves into terrible ideas. Because that's the core of that, poor assumptions, hubris are both variable, right? Smart people talk themselves into thinking dumb things are smart. Now, I don't want to be reductive, even though I just kind of was. There are millions of separate reasons smart people do dumb things, but I'm talking about the structure. Why smart people do dumb things, not the dumb things smart people do. Very smart people tend to neglect their emotional selves, and that leads to the dumbness, right? And that's not something that they chose to do. That's often something that comes down to their formative years, self-concept, sense of identity, so on and so forth. Basically, smart people can't admit they did a stupid thing because smart people are supposed to be smart. So instead of correcting for the mistake, they double down on the mistake. And this is what I mean when I say top 10 phrase, don't let problems that aren't your fault lead to mistakes that are. Now, if anything here inspires a question, comment, or suggestion, I expect this will hit some nerves. Go to nottherapyshow.com, fill out the contact form, or join our mailing list while you're there, or Not Therapy Show on Twitter, Instagram, and Threads. Not Therapy Show. I'm quite liking the chill vibe on Threads. Now, I love to reference Dungeons and Dragons on this topic of why smart people do dumb things. Because Dungeons and Dragons, as a game system, treats intelligence and wisdom as two separate abilities. Intelligence is the key stat for mages, and mages specialize in offensive and illusory spells. Fireball, magic missile, all that good stuff. But wisdom is the primary stat for clerics, and clerics specialize in healing, among other things. But healers are often really unsatisfying to play in fantasy role-playing games because a lot of game system and game masters don't reward experience points for anything but combat. So how can you build a character with a high wisdom score and end up with a satisfying play experience? Often you don't. But enough about my D&D grumblings. Wisdom is similarly undervalued in life. It's hard to build a game system for wisdom because, to the unwise, wisdom seems, like foolishness. Whether we have good judgment is often judged by those with poor judgment. It's completely subjective, and that results in absolutely fallacious arguments like the idea that being rich or successful in business proves someone is intelligent. In fact, the most common factor in whether someone is rich is whether their parents were rich. And many less than genius people run successful businesses because they were able to assemble the right people to backstop their own limitations. But the thing about intelligence is that we think it's measurable. We have a score for IQ. We test it. And okay, it's debatable how accurate IQ tests really are, but we still have them. Wisdom, measuring that is a lot harder. Insecure people love to tear down those of us who are content with enough. They call us losers, has-beens, washed up, and my favorite, past our prime. And that's seen by too many others. That name-calling is seen as strength and leadership. And it's not. The ability to look at your life and say, you know what? This is pretty good. That is the pinnacle of success, real success. But that ability can't be measured by anybody but you. And that ability rarely impresses the masses because most people don't get there. So you get people like Elon Musk and Donald Trump who have a great deal of career success, but clearly aren't happy or even emotionally regulated. What is going on? So this is the beginning of a series of shows about why smart people do dumb things. We're going to explore things like self-talk and expectations, assumptions, self-concept and imposter syndrome, and intellectualizing emotions. And all this is an attempt to show that being smart isn't the only way to be useful or successful. As I talked about with Jason Bradshaw a few weeks ago, we live in an achievement success culture where the grade or score is more important than what we learned. It feels good to be right, but some people make that their identity to the point that they can't admit they're wrong. Now, some of this is trauma. We'll get to that in future. But some of it is the belief that being smart is the only thing a person has going for them. And if they're not smart, they're nothing. So they have to be smart all the time. They try to be perfect in the smarts department. And you know what I say about perfect? Top 10 phrase, stop trying to be perfect. Perfect's a lie. It takes some work to realize that there's an in-between between being right all the time and being nothing. That sounds like madness, but I work with so many people who set one bar for the rest of the world and then an impossible, much higher bar for themselves. And right there is a smart person doing something that doesn't make any sense. If one of your first principles is equality, then equality applies to you. And if your standard for yourself is so much higher than everybody else, well, aren't you putting in way more work to get far fewer rewards than anyone else? How is that fair? To put it another way, let's go back to my golden rule thinking. That it's not about doing things for others that you'd want done for you. It's about not doing things to other people that you can't stand. Here's an example. I like knowing things, says the person following the golden rule. Therefore, I'm going to share information with others to make them smarter. Now that thought, share information with others because I like knowing things, risks leading you into behaviors where people think you're an obnoxious know-it-all. You're offering unsolicited advice and people don't care. Now let's flip the same concept on its ear into, I can't stand it when people won't stop trying to force information on me when I'm just not interested. So I'm going to ask people if they want to hear about something before I info dump on them. See how it's the same basic principle, how and when to share information, but the framing leads to very different outcomes? That's what I mean about the structure of why smart people do dumb things. Smart people can do dumb things when they let their ego, well, if I want this, everyone must want it, overpower their good sense. Because that ego gives them blind spots and they miss obvious things right at the beginning of their reasoning. And that's a primer for our interview after the break. Stay tuned for Dr. Jeff Nevid, author of The Minute Therapist on Psychology Today. We're going to be talking self-talk for smart people. Now, if anything inspires a question, comment, or suggestion, email me, Liana at NotTherapyShow, or go to nottherapyshow.com, fill out the contact form, join our mailing list while you're there, or Not Therapy Show at Not Therapy Show, 2 T's, Not Therapy Show, 3 words, on Twitter, Instagram, and Threads. We'll be back with Dr. Jeff Nevid after the break. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy, talking why smart people do dumb things, and it's time for the interview. This interview, I've got Dr. Jeff Nevid. He is the author of the Minute Therapist blog on Psychology Today, and Jeff is here to talk to us about self-talk. Jeff, thanks for joining us today. Tonight. Thanks. Okay, so self-talk. You wrote an article on self-talk, and you talked about why it's important to do it properly. Now, what does taking charge of your inner voice mean?
Well, first of all, self-talk. We all do it, even though we may not be willing to admit that we do it. It's part of our nature as thinking animals. We have dialogues with ourselves under our breath. In fact, I found a quote from Plato some 2,500 years ago where she spoke about the fact that when people think, they think in words that they express to themselves in silent speech. So it's long been recognized as part of our nature. And I think we should just join the dialogue. But in doing so, we should be able to recognize whether our own thoughts expressed in terms of inner speech represents a friend or a foe, something that's helping us to cope, or something that stands in the way.
And a lot of people learn, well, the fancy word is maladaptive behaviors in self-talk, right? You have a part in your article where you talk about questioning thoughts. You say,
Right.
Challenging negative thoughts, but challenging thoughts in general, right? Like, who says is when, who says this must be so, is one of the things you say, which, going back to the Greek philosophers, there's a lot of it in there. And I find that a lot of the assumptions that very intelligent people make start in their self-talk. They don't recognize the assumptions for what they are. Catastrophizing is a huge assumption, right? Oh, things are never going to go my way. Right. How do people start catching and reframing those cognitive distortions?
Well, there you go. You put your finger on it.
Yeah.
We have these dialogues with ourselves, but we're not generally reflective about them. We don't step back and ask ourselves what's running through our mind. We just assume that what we're thinking about mirrors reality. And I think it's always important to recognize, as philosophers recognize, that beliefs are merely opinions. They're not facts. We treat them as facts. When we treat them as facts, we don't inspect them, we don't evaluate them, we don't question them. So as a cognitive behavior therapist, what we try to do is identify these triggering thoughts that bring about emotional distress in the form of depression, anxiety, anger, guilt, and so on. We ask people to stop themselves in the act of thinking negatively, to step back, to first of all identify those negative thoughts, and then go through, as you saw, there's a series of questions that we often use in therapy to help people and guide them through this kind of process of self-reflection so that they can begin substituting coping thoughts for catastrophic negative thoughts and the like.
Now, there is the different type, and you see this a lot in the tech sector, places like that, of very smart people who get this self-concept. I have an IQ of 155, I am smart. And so they miss when they're wrong. And that's a form of, this is a form of negative thinking that doesn't seem negative in the first place. If you get a client like that, how do you help them retrain their thinking so that they can actually admit that they might be making a mistake?
Yeah, good point. Let me just identify some of the questions we ask people to ask themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Is it necessarily so, or does it just seem that way? What thoughts can I substitute for these negative thoughts? This is especially important in the work that we do in therapy. Whose voice does it sound like? And whose words are these? Who says I must think this way? Why not some other way? And so we invite people into a process in which they examine their thinking, evaluate it almost as a scientist would. Is there a factual basis to it? Or is it exaggerated, distorted in some way? And then to substitute more adaptive coping thoughts in their place. We can't control thoughts, and this is an important point. We can't control the thoughts that pop into our head.
Mm-hmm.
It's like trying not to feel anxious. If I told you you're anxious and I told you, stop feeling anxious.
Right, right. Yeah.
It's not something we can directly control. We can only control how we respond to our own thoughts or respond to our own emotions. That's where the control lies. And so when we have a negative thought, it's bouncing around the head. We have to take stock of it. We have to step back. We have to ask ourselves, is there another way of thinking about it? Why do I keep repeating this same negative thought to myself? Where does it come from? Whose voice does it sound like? Whose words does it sound like? So that's part of the process that we use.
Yeah. Now there's an entire, I hate to say, self-help industry geared at especially men that bombard people via videos or books with thoughts that are quite, disapproving father, right? Nobody cares about you. The world doesn't care. You have to be strong. You have to take what you want. And I mean, every time I hear it, I'm like, dear God, this sounds like, the stereotypical abusive father on the outside instead of the inside of these poor guys' heads. I'm sure you get some people through your practice that have been indoctrinated is the only word by this kind of thinking.
Oh, absolutely.
How do you begin the process of retraining that? Because that can be an incredibly painful thing to dismantle.
It is, but it is such a key part of the therapeutic process.
Mm-hmm.
It's about identifying these triggering thoughts. What are the thoughts that are setting off these emotional flares? And then it's better understanding the history of those thoughts. You weren't born with them.
Mm-hmm.
And somewhere along the line, somebody, in effect, planted those thoughts in your head. And probably because you were quite young at the time, you didn't question them, especially if you were young and you heard criticism from parental figures, from big people in your life. You didn't question it because young people, kids, don't question
Mm-hmm.
what they hear from elders because they assume that they're hearing something that's true.
Mm-hmm.
And that then becomes ingrained. It becomes part of I call it the brain code. It's part of your internal programming. And once that's set into motion, it's like the old broken record that repeats itself over and over and over and over again. And I see this in 65-year-old men, women. I see them still thinking those same negative thoughts that they've been thinking since they were 7 or 8 years old. And maybe finally they're coming to terms with it. It's not easy. It's not like you flip a switch. I'm not saying that, but it is part of a process. But you identify the thought. You try to trace its history. How did that thought come to be? I mean, you weren't born that way. Somewhere along the line, we try to go back in time to understand the origins of the thought. But as I try to get across on this blog for Psychology Today, the Minute Therapist. Change can only happen in the present. That's why it's called the Minute Therapist.
Okay.
If it happen at all, because clearly, maybe it goes without saying that the past is dead, and nobody knows what the future holds. And we can't make changes in the future. We can only make changes here in the present. Or another way of putting that, I'd say, is that tomorrow never comes, right? If you think about it,
Mm-hmm.
tomorrow never comes. So we try to examine what's happening here in the moment, and then to begin to make those changes in the here and now.
Now, I find that sometimes people have a really hard time stopping those, real beat yourself up thoughts, like get up, don't be weak, because they're covering up something that the person finds even worse. So when that's taken away, there's sort of a collapse that happens because they finally have to face the thing they're avoiding, right? That's tough. How do you recommend people face that? Because that's terrifying.
Well, you're saying it's a kind of defense or a kind of
Yeah, yeah.
smoke screen. And there is deep hurt. And we have to come to terms with that. We have to process it. But we have to get past all this garbage that's in a person's head. And to do that, like you do every day, you take out the garbage. So in effect, what I'm asking them to do
Mhm.
is take out their mental garbage, and then we'll see what else is there.
Now, for very, very intelligent people, intellectualizing and understanding one's thoughts can be very, very useful in taking out that garbage. But very intelligent people are also very good at avoiding their emotions through intellectualizing and having them stop and actually feel their feelings can go against their identity. And of course, you get a very, very strong reaction when somebody feels an identity threat. So how do you begin that process?
Well, I'll give you a case example. I'll change the facts, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm working with this man is very, very successful financially, and
Mm-hmm.
is retired. He was able to retire at a young age, uh, and so he's enjoying his life. He's now playing. He's playing tennis now, but he's taking that competitiveness with him onto the court in such a way that he's making himself miserable because
Mm-hmm.
everything now is still a test of his self-worth. He's got
Mm-hmm.
to prove that he could beat his opponent and beat his opponent into the ground even for
Mm-hmm.
him to feel secure in himself. And you could see how much wasted mental energy there is to that. Uh, it's a form of performance anxiety that enters the picture. I call it in his case, the thinking man's disease. It's
Mm-hmm.
when you evaluate your own performance, when you are so obsessed with how well you're doing something rather than just doing it. You get in your own way, basically.
Yeah, because if you don't have that internal validation, no amount of external validation is enough. We see that in a lot of these tech billionaires who are clearly very unhappy, self-destructive people. Because unfortunately, the world gives us this myth that if you go out and achieve, you'll be happy. But that's not so, because then imposter syndrome kicks in and it's never enough. That next thing is what's going to make me happy. That next thing is going to make me happy. So what do you do with someone who that competitive drive has, he perceives been, the reason he's been so successful, but that can make you very successful in one sector of your life, and
Right.
but it's really destructive in, say, personal relationships or maintaining friendships or so on and so forth. How do you how do you reframe, especially for men, because emotions are difficult when society punishes a lot of men for having those more vulnerable emotions, and it prizes intellect, get a college degree, get a white collar job. How do you begin pivoting to a more balanced intellect emotional paradigm without, you know risking complete collapse?
Well, it is about reframing.
Mhm.
It is about approaching things with a new mindset. And it's about leaving that old mindset, at the office door. And I'm working with this man in particular, and it's focused on that effort to try to see that he doesn't have to play that game anymore. That he doesn't have to value himself based on the score. and to begin to challenge and question that way of thinking. We can't eliminate it by just wishing it away.
Mm-hmm.
We can better understand it. But at the end of the day, what we have to be able to do is to respond differently to it. Okay, I'm having those thoughts again. I know I'm driving myself crazy with this. Step back from it, take a deep breath, go onto the court and just bat around the ball. And nothing terrible is going to happen. I don't have to prove anything. So it's a matter of reprogramming your self-talk, in effect, so that it's working for you rather than against you.
Now that I don't have to prove anything, that's a tough one because, we live in a productivity obsessed culture. Jeff, hold on. We got to take a break. Dr. Jeff Nevid, author of The Minute Therapist on Psychology Today, talking to us about self-talk, why smart, successful people can talk themselves into some not great things. Jeff will be back with us for more after the break. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, email me, Liana at nottherapyshow.com, or go to the website, nottherapyshow.com, or Twitter, Instagram threads, Not Therapy Show. We'll be back talking why smart people do dumb things. More on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. I'm still talking to Dr. Jeff Nevid, the Minute Therapist on Psychology Today, the Minute Therapist blog. And we're talking self-talk and why very successful people can have some trouble with their inner thoughts, their inner voice, how they talk to themselves. Now, before the break, we were talking about achievement culture. We give lip service to you have value just because you're a human being, but we really don't practice what we preach collectively. So, and that's really tough. The idea of, well, if I just go and bat about the ball, I'm not being productive. I'm not accomplishing anything. But that's not true. That's where the emotional processing happens, right? You have a task you can focus on, and so you can take out the mental garbage, right? That's what just doing things for the sake of doing them does.
Exactly. And I would say, you could change not only what you say to yourself, but what you say to others in the situation. You could go onto the court and you could say to whomever you're playing, you say, I'm going to make you feel really, really good about yourself. You could see at the end of this game, you're going to feel terrific about how you performed. So the emphasis, you take the monkey off your back.
Right.
And you diffuse that pressure. I wrote another piece a while back for Psych Today about applying what we could call the good enough standard. And that is a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people who are in competitive industries. But we have, at the end of the day, we have to come to terms with the fact we can only be the best version of ourselves. We can only do the best we can under the circumstances. We can't determine outcomes. We can only determine effort. And if you apply that standard, it's good enough. It's good enough. I was just listening to an interview with Paul Simon. It was an old interview, I mean, years ago, and he was being asked about his process of writing songs and when do you know it's good enough, right? When do you say this is it? I'm not doing it again. And he says it was the hardest thing he ever had to deal with because it could always be better. Mm-hmm. But he had to say it's good enough, and I'm ready to say it's good enough. And that comes from acquiring that inner mental discipline to be able to change what you say to yourself, so that there's so many countless examples of writers that held off publishing out of fear because they didn't think that it was quite good enough to publish, and it sat in the desk for year after year. That's no way to live a life. I don't think, personally. I think we have to kind of step back and say, it's good enough.
I have a few clients that are doing that right now. They're really good books that they're just not finishing the last chapter because they're psyched out that it's not going to be good enough. And right. I think you put on something in this era of 60 to 80 hour work weeks being normalized, and the idea of You always have to be first, the tech sector uses move fast and break things, and yet it seems like all they do is break things. I think how we measure achievement and like you said, talk to others and create groups of people where setting a goal that's an achievable, but perhaps ambitious, but still
Mhm.
achievable
Right,
goal.
right,
And when
right,
you get there, stop for the day. That is,
right.
I think, a really important adult skill that a lot of people don't learn until they hit it's not even happening in the 40s and 50s anymore. There's people coming down with very serious stress related illnesses in their 20s and 30s. And that's the thing that finally makes them realize I can't do this anymore. I have to rewrite all my paradigms. So, what are some things
Well,
that
you said
people
you,
so go
you
ahead,
really
yeah.
did. I think you really did identify what's important here is
Hmm.
that you have to be able to. You can't put your self-esteem in other people's baskets.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to establish, you said achievable, absolutely true.
Hmm.
You have to establish achievable goals. When I work with clients, virtually every session is around, okay, let's talk about this week. What are your goals for this week that you can accomplish, right? Not,
Hmm.
not winning a lottery or curing cancer, but something that you could, at the end of the day, say to yourself, I did that. And I did this other thing too.
Hmm.
And if you could say that at the end of the day, and then you build upon it the next day, you are in effect validating yourself. You're not waiting for somebody to validate you because
Right.
that's waiting for Godot. It's not going to happen. We're never going to get that external validation to a point that we feel secure enough unless we begin to validate ourselves.
Yeah, and that's a difficult concept. The validating yourself is a difficult concept for people to get their heads around. Let me try to explain it and you tell me if I'm right. It's the difference between setting a goal of, say, at work, instead of going, I'm going to get promoted to vice president in 2 years, which you can't control. It's, I'm going to make
Right.
sure I check in with my direct supervisor to see what I can improve and set goals and improvement accordingly. You can control that. And the reality is that that second goal set, first of all, you can measure that. You know whether you're doing that or not. And that's self validating. But also, I've found it's more likely to get you where you want to go than to set a goal based on external validation that doesn't have a roadmap to get there. Is that right?
No, it's absolutely right. And it
Yeah.
goes back to the ancient philosophy of Stoicism and understanding what we can control and we can't control. We can't control outcomes. We could only control the effort. It's the same sort of thing. If I give you an analogy, when we work with parents who are trying to discipline their kids or get them to study more, brush their teeth, or whatever the case may be, you can give the kid a reward for getting an A, right?
Mhm.
Better yet, you could reward the kid for the effort that they're putting into it because they can't determine whether they get an A or not, but they can determine the effort that they put into it. And that's what should be rewarded, not the outcome. It's the same thing as adults that we need to apply to ourselves, that way of thinking.
I had a teacher on a few weeks ago, Jeff, that said the exact same thing. That's
Really?
awesome. He's going to be thrilled about that because we talked about grade chasing
Right.
and how it actually discourages healthy risk. Because, I mean, what's the best way to get a good mark? To stay in your comfort zone and only do things you know you're good at instead of, learning a new skill because everybody's terrible when they start. And I do think that external validation, I think I've done this with my team. When things don't go well is exactly when it's good to praise when you saw someone do something right, right? Because when things are going great, everybody knows it was good. If people don't get an ideal outcome, pointing out to them, okay, it didn't go your way, but you did, you stood up for yourself, you set boundaries, you expressed yourself clearly, and you were emotionally vulnerable, and all those are good things. Do that again, even if you didn't get the outcome you wanted.
Yeah. Going further with that, if it just reminded me of something that was said at my daughter's college graduation. You don't remember, who remembers what was said in those graduations? I do remember this one line, and it stuck with me, and I use it with my patients. You may find it, and others may find it helpful. And this woman said, failure is not fatal, it is feedback.
Mhm.
And that, I think is very profound. That even from failure, we could take something of value from that, and work to do better the next time. It's not fatal. But if we treat it as fatal, then we're setting ourselves up.
Yeah, especially in that transition from college to the working world where we go from a more objective structure of right and wrong testing, grades, numerical values, to more qualitative feedback, whether your boss likes you, whether you're a good fit with a team, whether you have the interpersonal skills. And that's so jarring for
Yeah.
people just coming out of a very, very intense educational system that puts it into their heads that, you fail one test, you're not going to get into a good school. And so you're not going to get a good job. So you're going to die poor and penniless, even in families with intergenerational wealth. It stops making sense. The existential dread that is being programmed into young people that they spend their entire 20s trying to undo really takes me aback. I see these young people whose parents are paying for their college education. Their parents are saying, don't worry if you can't get a job right away. We want you to be happy. We want you to find the right job. These young people in their early 20s are losing it. What would you say to someone who is putting that, exceptionalist driven pressure on themselves?
Well, I see it in my students. I
Yeah.
train psychologists, clinical psychologists, and I see that they value themselves based on how their patients are doing,
Oh,
rather than what they're doing in therapy. And it's again, you're judging yourself by outcomes you can't control. And I think we have to step back from that. And that's something where we work with them. It's also like I do research as well. So that's a professor. And I had a student who came to me, well, and said to me, the fact, Dr. Nevid, will I still get my degree if I don't get the results I want from
oh,
my dissertation? Think,
wow.
yeah, and that's what they think. If I don't get the significant result, because that's so much pressure so much value is placed on that, will I get my degree? Right.
Right.
You're absolutely right that this is a generation, it may not be the only generation of which we have socialized young people to focus only on outcomes and
Mm-hmm.
value themselves only on outcomes. And there's a cost to be paid emotionally.
I think as well, when we prop up, Mark Zuckerberg, who's, drops out of Harvard to found Facebook, that's luck. That is not something you can set out to achieve. And people think that's the bare minimum instead of that's really maybe not lucky because, he created a whole set of problems for himself and the world, being that successful without the wisdom to handle it. And I find that comparative to these young psychologists in training who don't seem to recognize that patient outcomes have as much to do with the patient as the clinician, right?
Right.
If the patient's not ready, and I hate that term, but it's true. Sometimes people aren't in a place where they can do the work. And that's not a moral judgment. That's just the reality. And, you can hold their hand, you can support them, you can keep them stable, but they're not going to improve until they're prepared to take the steps. And that's not the therapist's fault. It's nobody's fault. It's just sometimes how do you handle when a student makes a mistake? Because when you're dealing with somebody's mental health, that's big. It's
Well,
a
I
big
think
responsibility. Yeah.
if I may, I mean, the very first, when I supervise students, the very first thing I say to them, and they're green, they're second year doctoral students, and they're seeing
Mhm.
their first patients. I say, you're going to make mistakes. Accept it. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to learn from the mistakes, but everybody makes mistakes, right?
Mhm.
Uh, And it's an important lesson for us all that we are none of us perfect.
Hmm.
Uh, we have to apply that good enough standard, not a perfection standard to ourselves. And we all screw up at the end of the day. But what is it that we take away from that? How can we learn from that?
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
like to think of emotions as signals. When we're feeling anxious, it's a signal that there's a threat that we're facing.
Hmm.
When we are angry, it's a signal that somebody has treated us unfairly. When we're feel guilty, it's a signal that we've stepped beyond our moral code.
Hmm.
And uh, these are built into our nervous system as signaling devices, much like pain is a signal that there's an injury in the body.
Hmm.
It gets our attention. Uh, and if we want to use the signal, we have to then ask ourselves, okay, you know, uh, what can I do differently the next time? Or
Hmm.
how can I cope with the situation? But continuing to worry or be anxious or guilty or angry after you get the signal and you respond to it, it's worthless. It's
Yeah.
pointless.
Yeah. And if you fight the negative stimulus, then you're just going to keep making the same mistakes and making an even bigger mess. Um,
Learn from the signal, learn what you can do for yourself
mhm.
differently. And because that's all you can ever do. You can't erase what's happened. Use even failure as feedback.
Right. Alan Moore, who's a comic book writer, he wrote Watchmen, V for Vendetta, From Hell, a bunch of things that have turned into movies. He recommends that would-be writers go out and read bad books. If you want to be, a TV or film producer, see bad movies because they got made. They're piles of junk, but they got
Right,
made. So
right, right.
you don't have to be perfect to do it. And I just think that's wonderful advice. Dr. Jeff Nevin, author of The Minute Therapist on Psychology Today. Check him out. Jeff, a lot of really great insights. Thanks very much. Do you have a website or anything else that people can check you out, or is it just the blog?
Well, there's the blog, and I maintain a private practice in Manhattan, also through the Psychology Today referral service, and people can check out my bio there.
Are you taking patients?
Oh, sure, sure, sure.
Awesome. In the Manhattan area.
Right. In Manhattan or by teletherapy, people who they must live in New York State.
Right.
That's
Right,
where.
right.
But
And I'm sure my previous guest, Jason Bradshaw, will be happy to hear a lot of his things about academics echoed. He's a chemistry teacher, high school chemistry teacher. So, yeah, I'm sure. Jeff, thanks so much.
my pleasure. Have a good day.
When we come back, final thoughts, I'll talk about how to center your self-worth so you don't end up being a smart person who does dumb things. After the break on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist, and we are still talking why smart people do dumb things. My first in a series of why smart people do dumb things, because we've spent 40 minutes on it, more than 40 minutes on it, and we've barely scratched the surface. This is, I think, something we all grapple with in a culture that prizes intelligence, that prizes, a college degree, and then some of the dumbest, most awful people we'll meet in our lives are highly accredited. So if anything in this show inspires a question, comment, or suggestion, Liana at nottherapyshow.com, or go to nottherapyshow.com, fill out the contact form. That first thing, Liana at nottherapyshow.com, was my email address, by the way, or nottherapyshow on Twitter, Instagram, and Threads. Okay, where to go? If you feel a little called out, I kind of see myself in some of this stuff. You're hyper competitive. You're very achievement driven. You feel that if you're not being productive, you're doing something wrong. Okay, how to break this cycle? This is how I did it. First of all, you need processing time. I read this wonderful article by an author about how slow braining things is not wasted time. Taking time to just mull stuff over, to sit in the backyard, with I believe she said glass of lemonade. I prefer something stronger. Sit and kind of watch the world go by. Take stock that actually improves your productivity when you are in work mode. If you never stop, you never get rest, and it eventually affects your performance long term. So use that as a rationale for changing your behavior. Now, about this need to be useful, need to be productive. There are many situations in life where there is no simple right or wrong answer. And what someone needs more than anything is a friendly ear, not an informative mouth. Top 10 phrase, listen twice before you talk once. That is there for the urge to just be smart. No. Listen twice before you talk once so you don't sound dumb trying to be smart. Sounding dumb trying to be smart is easier than you think it is. We've all been there. Some of us recognize we've been there. But just being there with someone. I recently was working with a client. I have a lot of artists, writers, musicians as personal clients. And, I mentioned he was really struggling with the last chapter of a book. And we just started talking. And I said, to me, this is what this story means to me. Not telling him what he should do, just how it made me feel, my reaction to his story. And I just started saying, whoa, right, I want to write this down. I wasn't intending to feed him dialogue for his book, but we found a thread and we did it together. It wasn't me helping him. It wasn't me schooling him. It was just me being there with him and having an emotional response, an authentic, supportive, emotional response to what he was doing and what he was working on. And that was more powerful than any book smarts or theory or citations out there. And when we prize our intelligence and we are valued for our intelligence in our jobs, it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that really getting enthusiastic about something, really connecting to it as a human who appreciates something another human's doing, that can be more helpful, more useful, more productive, more inspiring than any intellectual knowledge or book learning out there. That is wisdom. And that's where we're going to land for this episode. Thanks for joining me. Question, comment, suggestion, nottherapy.show.com. Email me directly, Liana@nottherapyshow.com. Join our mailing list on the website or at Not Therapy Show on Twitter, Instagram, and Threads. I'm really enjoying Threads. Until next time with part 2, you're crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you. Talk then.